I think we're ready, Rob.
All right, we're doing it?
We're doing it.
All right, awesome. Hi, this is awkward, by the way, staring at a camera, but I think we can do this. My name is Rob Shirkey. I'm a lawyer from Toronto. I went to school, actually, I did my law degree at the University of Victoria. And I'm grateful to the community of Colwood for bringing forward this resolution to the Association of Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities Conference, which I understand is coming up in mid-April. The resolution, of course, being what I'm working on, a simple proposal to get climate change labels on gas pump nozzles. And so it's one of these ideas where it's simple but deceivingly so. There's actually a lot of interesting research and thought behind it. And so I want to share that with you today. I've given lectures on the subject across North America at universities and all sorts of other places. I have an abbreviated version of this talk. It's a TEDx talk, and you can find it on our website. But this is really the best resource I'm going to try and share with you in sort of an hour-long lecture why this idea is compelling and why you might want to vote in favor of it, why you might want to pursue it. And for those of you that are familiar with the comic book film adaptations from Marvel and DC, if you stay to the end, I've decided to share some of the personal story behind this project. I've been encouraged to do so because people often ask, how did you start doing this? And I just realized though, Darren, as I'm saying this, if it's on YouTube, they can totally scroll to it. So don't scroll, stay to the end. Okay, without further ado, just a quick backgrounder on climate change to ensure we're all on the same page. Ice core samples that scientists have taken tell us there's basically data that we can get from these tiny trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere, much like the tiny trapped bubbles of air you'll see in your ice cube tray, that the historic range of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere over the last 800,000 years ranges from 180 to 300 parts per million. Now, if I were to take a fistful of air from this room and measure it for CO2 content, I would get a reading of roughly 400 parts per million. So for all intents and purposes, for all of human history, where we're at today is unprecedented. And all it is a result of us burning fossil fuels in a variety of ways that's taken carbon that's been locked under the Earth for a very long time, released it into our atmosphere, it's being absorbed by our oceans, and so on. So this is the second and last slide I'm showing you on climate change. 3 figures from this slide. The first figure, 2 degrees Celsius. It was in 2009 that the world got together in Copenhagen at an annual conference of the United Nations to try and address the challenge of climate change. And one of the things that came out of that was this political consensus that we can't go over a temperature increase as measured since the Industrial Revolution of more than 2 degrees Celsius. So this is a political consensus. A lot of scientists say it's actually dangerously high, but nevertheless, this is sort of our global goal to stay below this threshold. Scientists ask the question, this sort of sets a ceiling on temperature increase. They ask the question then, working backwards from that, if we know there's this threshold that we can't exceed, and we know that our burning of fossil fuels causes warming that sort of brings us closer to this threshold, how much CO2 can we emit before we commit to this 2 degrees centigrade increase? And the figure that they came up with was 565 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide. And I've seen figures that are slightly lower and slightly higher, and I'm not going to ask you to remember any of these numbers, but the takeaway is sort of conceptual. If you set a limit on temperature increase, necessarily then, working backwards from that, you create what many are now calling a carbon budget. So we know how much can bring us to this figure. It was a group of financial analysts out of the United Kingdom that then asked the question, well, how much do we have left to burn? And to approximate that value, what they did is they looked at the assets, so proven reserves, coal, oil, natural gas, of publicly traded companies, state-owned companies, to try and add all those figures up to get a sense of global proven reserves. And so they did just that. They added up those values from all sorts of companies and state-owned companies, and they came up with this figure. 2,795 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide would be released if we sort of carry through with the status quo business game plan. And so, of course, you'll notice this circle is way bigger than this circle, roughly 5 times so. Many people are now saying that we need to leave perhaps 4/5 or even 2/3, depending on the estimate, of our global proven reserves underground and unburned. Otherwise, we're really reaching breaking points on our sort of climate. So we don't want to do that. What are people saying? Oh, sorry, one last thing. The chief economist of the International Energy Agency said that if we actually carry through with the status quo business game plan, we're looking at a temperature increase of maybe 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. Of course, it's more than just that. Our oceans absorb CO2 that causes acidification and so on. And then there's all sorts of feedback loops. So if we cause warming, carry of CO2, this could result in a melting of permafrost, which releases methane, which has a greater global warming potential than CO2 does. So that's the challenge that we face. What are people saying? You have Barack Obama, who was recently quoted as having said, "We're not going to be able to burn it all. I very much believe in keeping that 2 degrees Celsius target as a goal." You have our very own Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, now governor of the Bank of England, and an economist who says, "The vast majority of reserves are unburnable. One should think of them as stranded assets." So we find ourselves at this point in time where civilization has benefited so much from our use of fossil fuels, but we're learning more and more that it's coming at a cost, and an unsustainable one. And there are all sorts of people that are working on wonderful, sustainable solutions, clean technology, places that we can transition to on the one hand. I think, though, there's a lot of sort of systemic inertia to the status quo. So here we are stuck on the status quo. We need to transition to this place. Part of that transition means sort of challenging the status quo, creating a sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo, creating more space then for this transition. And that is what I'm working on. And I think the tool that I'm advocating for, it's quite possibly one of the cheapest climate interventions on the planet, which is actually kind of exciting. And it is, quite simply, climate change and air pollution labels on gas pump nozzles. And I have a mock-up right here. For those of you that have asked, I did not steal this from a gas station. There's not a hose going like this somewhere. In Toronto, you can order anything online. I just got this online. But the idea is, quite simply, there's a lot of gas stations that actually use this space right now for advertising. And imagine if you can use this space instead to highlight some of the impacts of our fossil fuel use and the impact that might have. And I'll go over that shortly. We've developed a few mock-ups. And I'm not necessarily saying this is the image that we need, this is the text that we need. Think of this more as conceptual. So I couldn't come out with this idea sort of in the abstract. It'd be great to ground it in something. And this is actually exciting. There's students from Capilano's Idea School of Design that are working on labels that highlight local impacts of climate change. And there are students as well from UBC's Sauder School of Business that plan on studying which of those labels are the most effective. And so I'm encouraging municipalities to develop their own labels that reflect sort of local impacts of climate change. Having said that, though, I do think that there is value to this format, this image and text format that I'll go into. But it's actually frightening. The language that I use here comes from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the global authority on the subject, and it goes to show how much is at stake with this issue. This is another mock-up intended to show ocean acidification. Our oceans are warming, absorbing a lot of heat. They're also absorbing CO2 that causes acidification. There's a lot of marine life that can only survive in a certain temperature range and a certain pH range. You go outside of that, and you're risking affecting entire ecosystems. You'll notice as well that I have a suggestion here, and I think this is a good format to follow, where you convey, the nature of the problem, but then also there could be a resource that people can go to learn how there might be some individual actions they can take on climate change to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions footprint. And though that is important, this ultimately is geared at more of a systems change, and I'll go into that shortly. Of course, you can highlight also local impacts of combusting fuel in vehicles and the exhaust that then we all inhale. It's funny, but I mean, just this morning I was walking down the street here in Toronto. There I am on the sidewalk, and maybe 6 feet from my nose, car after car spewing the stuff in my face that I'm actually inhaling is entering my lungs, is sort of going through my body, through my bloodstream, and it has been linked to cardiovascular disease, to cancers, and so on. So the idea is, we actually can do a lot better. We just need to challenge the status quo. to transition us to this place where we are then doing better. I launched this out of Toronto in early 2013, so about 2 years ago. It was a globally unprecedented idea without many resources too. We actually don't have a budget, but it's fascinating to see the amount of traction it's received. So the concept has been endorsed by over 100 leaders in their field, so academics from the natural sciences, social sciences, policy, economics, business law, and so on, have endorsed this concept. Prominent figures like James Hansen from NASA, Michael Mann, a climate scientist highly regarded, people from UBC, from UVic, from Simon Fraser. You can go and see who's endorsed this at our website. Also, it's been endorsed by NGOs, the David Suzuki Foundation, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, Clean Air Partnership, and so on. Why is it getting traction? I think it's in part because it's familiar. A lot of people say, oh, it reminds me like the tobacco warning labels, and I was very deliberate in the design of it. I'm sort of trying to evoke that because we've been primed with this example. What's interesting, so people ask the question, do tobacco labels work? Thinking if those might work, then maybe this might have some sort of an impact too. The answer is yes, they do. So it was in 2001 that Canada became the first jurisdiction in the world to require the pictorial labels on tobacco packages. The United States came out with the text-only labels. It was in the early to mid-60s. Many years later, Canada said, let's put an image on it. It might be more compelling. Since then, something like 50 to 60 countries have adopted our innovation. So there's a real interesting story of leadership in that, actually, Canadian leadership, a simple innovation that has gone on to have a big impact around the world. But going back to the question, do these things have any sort of an impact? There's independent studies from countries all over the world that try to answer that question. And in 2009, the European Union commissioned a meta-study, so a study of studies. And they looked at over 200 studies to try and figure out and answer that question. The overall conclusion was yes, these labels do work. They help to change both attitudes and behavior. So shifts in behavior are important. It's reducing your consumption of cigarettes, maybe quitting altogether, and so on. And there's maybe some parallels in the context that I'm advocating for. But it's the shift in attitudes that I'm more interested in and what that can enable. I asked myself, though, you know, as a lawyer, I think, and with the background, I studied business and economics and psychology in undergrad, but I asked myself, you know, would these businesses spend a lot of money on lawyers fighting this legislation wherever it crops up all over the planet if it didn't have the potential to affect their bottom line? So industry's response to these labels effectively concede that, yes, they are impactful. More generally, though, there's an entire consumer packaged goods industry that hires psychologists and runs focus groups, and they tinker with packaging. So they tinker with the color, the font, the image, the copy, the texture of the packaging, and so on, all with the explicit purpose of influencing consumer attitudes and behavior. So, of course, the way you package a product, the way you present a product, will have some sort of an impact on consumer attitudes and behavior. It'd be preposterous to think otherwise. Having said that, though, I like to think that this idea is actually even more compelling in the context of climate change, and I'll go over a few of the reasons now. So first, I like to say that climate change can be understood as a problem of no feedback. And what I mean by that, quite simply, is there's a delay between cause and effect. So we burn fossil fuels today, the consequences of which aren't experienced until tomorrow. And in the absence of feedback, we fall prey to our cognitive biases, one of which psychologists call the current moment bias or hyperbolic discounting. And it's this tendency, it's human nature really, for us to prefer interests that are small and near in time relative to those that are significant but far down the road. It's why we procrastinate. I'm sure many of us can relate. I've given lectures at universities where some students have said, oh, you know, when I had that test a week or so down the road that was worth a quarter of my grade, what I did was on the background of my laptop, I put a note, stop getting on Facebook, or don't watch that YouTube video, for the simple reason that it counteracts that. It's a bit of a hack, you know, so intuitively people actually use this in their own lives. What our idea does, quite simply, is it counteracts the current moment bias. So through the use of image and text, it takes that faraway consequence, brings it into the here and now. It actually takes a problem of no feedback and it builds feedback. So in this inexpensive policy idea, really it's just a sticker, which only costs a few pennies to print, we're actually addressing an aspect of human nature and an aspect of climate change, one of the reasons we fail to act on this issue. Interestingly, so Mark Carney, who I mentioned before, this is a quote of his, he calls this the tragedy of horizons, and he says it's the tendency of market actors to look only to the near term and not the future. So imagine if you could bring the future a little more into the here and now, how that might impact market actors. On the political side of things, you have Barack Obama, who I mentioned earlier, who says, one of the hardest things in politics is getting a democracy to deal with something now where the payoff is long-term or the price of inaction is decades away. So imagine if you can bring the price of an action that's decades away more into the here and now. The freedom then, the space that you might give a politician to address this issue in a variety of ways. So it truly is a catalyst for change. I'd like to also say, as a second point, that climate change can be understood as a problem of diffusion of responsibility. So I contribute a little bit to the problem. My friend Darren, who's off screen, contributes a little bit to the problem too. And you contribute a little bit to the problem. And collectively, you know, we're actually altering the chemistry of our planet. But as individuals, our contribution to the problem is small. And it's this nature of the problem where responsibility for something is diffuse, so when it's shared among many, we're actually less likely to act. And social psychologists see that played out in scenario after scenario after scenario. One of the more famous studies comes from, it's a tragic story, a woman who was assaulted in New York, Kitty Genovese. I'm sure many of you have heard of this example, where many, many people, 50, 60, 70 people heard her cries for help. Nobody intervened. Everyone was thinking that someone else will. It's strange, but there's actually a greater likelihood of intervention where fewer people witness that sort of a crime. The fix is really simple, and an analogy I like to use comes from CPR. So if you've ever taken a CPR course, you know that if I'm administering CPR to someone, I don't say somebody, anybody, please call 911. I say you, and I make eye contact. You call 911 and get back to me when you do. The reason for that is really simple. In the former example, responsibility for intervention is diffuse, it's shared among many, no one's going to intervene. In the latter, we've sort of concentrated responsibility. There's a greater likelihood that that person will then intervene. So what this idea does, quite simply, is it takes a problem of diffuse origins and it locates responsibility right in the palm of your hand. So again, it addresses this inexpensive, simple intervention, addresses an aspect of climate change. It also addresses an aspect of human nature. And I challenge you to think about anything like this. I don't think there's anything like it in the world that connects us to this problem in quite a direct way, either by building feedback or addressing this aspect of diffusion of responsibility. So I truly actually do think, as simple as it is, again, I think it's revolutionary. So it takes a problem of diffuse origins, it locates responsibility. The last reason I think it's compelling is a concept from economics called externalities, and I find the best way to explain this is just by use of an example. So let's say that a liter of gasoline costs $1.35 at the pump. You know this is an old slide because we're no longer at that price. Gas is cheaper now. But let's say that's the price of gas at the pump. So that's also sort of the signal of the cost, the worth, the value of the product to the marketplace. And there are a variety of costs that the producer had to incur in order to bring that product to market for us, the consumer, to consume. So in that $1.35, there's a little bit of labor that had to be compensated, people that extracted the stuff out of the earth. The product, you know, there was some machines that had to be used during that extraction process. There's a cost there to the producer. There's some energy that went into that process. They had to pay for that. The product had to be shipped. It had to be refined. It had to be brought to an individual retailer. So the costs go higher and higher. Of course, you know, I'm in the not-for-profit industry, but not everyone is in that. So naturally, there's a profit margin. They're not doing this for free. And there's taxes on top of that. All of that informs that $1.35 value. So that's the signal, again, to the marketplace of the value, the cost, the worth of this product. But economists know that there are a variety of costs that have been externalized. So if we burn fossil fuels, that causes a warming, that causes a melt in glaciers, that then causes a rise in sea level. That then means that communities have to spend billions of dollars to upgrade their coastal infrastructure to deal with these problems. That's a cost that's borne by all of us collectively, and it's one that's sort of levied almost down the road. But economists say, well, we should actually reflect that in the price of the product that's causing the harm. It makes no sense to pay for it down the road. Where's the signal there to change? Put it in the price of the product that's causing the harm. That's sort of then the rationale behind pricing carbon. So people are advocating for cap and trade regimes, carbon taxes, and so on. That's the theory behind it. So we know that there are some external costs, for example, upgrades to coastal infrastructure. Maybe it's hard to grow food in certain drought-stricken areas, so there's an agricultural hit there. Maybe there's more and more extreme weather, so that's there's an economic hit there as well. Maybe there's impacts to healthcare and so on. So the costs go higher and higher. Through pricing carbon and internalizing that, we then collectively understand that, this solution is actually quite costly. We become then more interested in less costly solutions. It's how you facilitate a market shift. The tricky thing is, so it's one thing to price the concrete and rebar that goes into upgrading our coastal infrastructure, but what on earth is the dollar value of a species that faces extinction? How do you price human life, suffering, and so on? All the other sort of external costs or hidden costs associated with our burning of fossil fuels. And I asked myself a few questions. One, and this is paraphrasing Oscar Wilde, I asked, have we reached the point where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing? The other question I ask is, well, what if there are other ways to communicate these externalities to the marketplace? And there is. That's actually what I'm advocating for. So what this idea does in the abstract, pricing carbon, is it captures and communicates externalities to the marketplace in a quantitative way, using the language of dollars and cents. What this idea does is it captures and communicates externalities to the marketplace in a qualitative way, using this other language, this language of image and text. And it's interesting too, because in the abstract, while they're doing the same thing, I think this has the potential to, on the ground, engage our sense of humanity in a way that a 5 or 10 cent increase at the pump never will. And while I do think that this mechanism is important, I also think, and if you do at the end of the day think that that's perhaps one of the more important tools, this can sort of perhaps reduce resistance to that other tool. It can make that conversation a little more palatable because we'll be aware of these hidden costs. Having said that, though, I actually tend to think that this is one of the more interesting interventions, and I'll explain it a little bit in the next slide. So it takes a problem of externalities and it communicates them. So there's basically, two worldviews. I'll call this one over here our dominant economic paradigm, and this is this idea that we often attribute to Adam Smith, that we as human beings, we are these rational, wealth-maximizing beings, self-interested, that would respond like automatons to price signals, say. So that's one worldview. You have this other worldview that maybe suggests, well, we're something more than that as human beings. We're motivated in other ways, too. And it's interesting, Adam Smith actually, and I encourage you just to Google Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was actually the first book he ever wrote, and it was the last book that he wrote, too. He came out with a subsequent edition before he passed away. And just read the first page of the first chapter of that book and think about this intervention as you're reading that. So it's curious. So perhaps we as human beings, we might be interested in the well-being of others. Perhaps we have some sense of empathy. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe we're both. But worldview informs choice of policy, right? So if, for example, if this is what we are as human beings, well then yes, this is the sort of language that we respond to, so we should have this sort of a policy tool. If, however, either instead of that or in addition to that, if this is what we are as human beings, perhaps we respond to this sort of signal, this sort of tool. Maybe it resonates with us a little bit more. So that's interesting, but I think worldview informs choice of policy. I think policy also reinforces worldview. So the more of this sort of signal that we have out there, the more this gets, that particular narrative gets reinforced. I once gave a lecture to a student. He was doing his master's in environmental sciences, and he said, thank goodness, because we're forced to basically shoehorn certain sets of values into this idea. They call it ecosystems valuation. So you can't say, let's protect this species because it has intrinsic value. Let's take care of this forest because it has some sort of intrinsic value. I enjoy being in this space. We say, well, if we were to get rid of that forest, what would be the cost in terms of cleaning the air, cleaning the water, how would property values be impacted, and so on. So we say that forest, it's $2.1 million. So we're actually forced to sort of shoehorn certain sets of values into this narrative. Wouldn't it be interesting, though, if instead of asking the question, how do I price that, you just ask the broader question, how do I communicate that? So it then doesn't mean that we have to price certain sets of values. So he really appreciated that, which was refreshing, I guess. So I'll also ground this, though, in a study, so it's less abstract. And this study came out of a bunch of daycares in Israel where people were coming late to pick up their kids. So they had a contract, they owed the daycare so much a week, but there was sort of this external cost that wasn't reflected in the price of that bargain. And that was, people were coming late, and so the daycare provider had to shift back their dinner plans, change their social schedule, and so on. So a bunch of economists said, maybe we should price that. We should, for every minute someone's late, I can't remember the exact value, but for every minute someone's late, let's say we price that $1. So if I'm late 15 minutes, I owe the daycare $15, half hour, I owe them $30, and so on. So traditional economic thinking suggests that people would then be more incentivized to come earlier. What actually happened, though, was the opposite. People came later because the thinking changed. You effectively commodified lateness. It became this thing to buy and sell, right? And instead of people saying, well, I feel this sort of sense of accountability to a fellow human being, I really should get there on time, the thinking was now, well, I can afford that. So it's curious, especially in the context of pricing carbon, which I do think we need to do, but in the context of pricing carbon, the political reality is we're not going to see that high of a jump because no one's going to get elected to office on that sort of a platform. Could it be then that we'll price carbon and we'll just sort of go, wash our hands clean of the thing and say we've dealt with it? Is that marginal increase actually going to have the kind of impact that we hope, or might it lead to perhaps other unintended consequences? Having said that, though, basically in that example, behavioral economists observe that sometimes when pricing certain externalities, you shut off these sort of moral cues that otherwise regulate human relationships and human behavior. So I think this, again, and I'm not arguing against this tool, the typical sort of approach that everyone seems to advocate for, this could be perhaps an important complement to that, or a gateway to that discussion. More than that, though, I think about the price of gasoline and how I mentioned on the previous slide, it's now, was it $1.35 when I first made it, now it's at about $1 or so. If you have a 5 or 6 cent carbon tax, say, if the price of gasoline drops, it's actually probably not having all that much of an impact. That tool for communicating external costs is variable. It changes with price. This tool is constant. No matter what the price of gasoline is, this is always communicating that market externality. So it has a benefit in that respect. More than that, though, many people know, this is sort of almost like economics 101, the demand response to changes in price of gasoline is fairly inelastic. So what that means is price goes up by a few cents, price goes down by a few cents. We actually don't really change our behavior much. We might grumble about the price of gas and say, oh, those companies are gouging me, or oh, the government is sort of taking my tax dollars, and so on. Nothing really changes, though. I think this can bring us, and I'll sort of elaborate on a subsequent slide, I think it can sort of take us from this place where we complain about the price of gas, perhaps not do much about it though, to this place where we're asking governments and business to do better. And there's actually also an interesting study that was done by 2 profs, one out of Ivy at Western and the other at Ottawa, because I know in British Columbia there is a carbon tax and it is having an impact, but they looked at the impact in the gasoline market. And I'll see if I could send you a link to the study, but they actually theorize that it's not so much the change in price that's incenting behavioral change, but rather it's the rationale behind that. the environmental reasons behind that. So it's curious. Wouldn't it be interesting if we sort of activated this muscle a little more than that muscle? One last bit, and this is more from communications theory. I think this is actually a really interesting aspect of this project. A lot of people tell me, but Rob, I've already heard about climate change. I've heard that fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels contributes to climate change. What is this going to do? And so I'll ask you to think of that and think of this idea in the context of Marshall McLuhan's work. So his famous line, "The medium is the message." So I may have heard about this problem through film, documentaries, say, books. I may have read about it. I may have read about it in a newspaper article and so on. All of those media, just by virtue of their form, I engage with that. The message is received. I'm sort of this passive observer. So there it is. It's unfolding on that TV screen, or there it is. It's unfolding on that movie screen, or there it is here in the newspaper. What this idea does is the medium, being the gas pump nozzle, actually is the message, and I transition from passive observer to active participant. So while I may have actually heard about some of this stuff before, I've never received this communication in quite a unique way. So it truly is revolutionary. So it controls sort of the form of human association. Also, though, it controls the scale, because if you think about it, you know, who's watching climate change documentaries? It's not the people that should be watching climate change documentaries. Who's buying and reading climate change books? Again, it's not the people that need to be reading climate change books. This idea engages a whole other segment that isn't necessarily seeking out this information. So it's interesting in that respect too. So there's a lot of thought behind it. What do I think it'll actually do? So I like to say that it's a disruptive innovation, and the story that I tell to illustrate this comes from several months ago, this experiment that I did on my mom. And if you ever see this on YouTube, Mom, hi Ma. All right, cool. So I was doing this experiment where I was showing up at her place for breakfast. She lives uptown in Toronto, I live downtown. And I was trying to catch her in the morning when her fuel gauge was close to empty. So we had breakfast maybe 2 or 3 times. I noticed on, say, I think it was the 3rd time, her fuel gauge was close to empty. So I thought, you know what? In all likelihood, she's going to gas up during the day today. And so I said, hey, we've been hanging out so much, having such a great time. How about I visit you in the evening for supper? And my mom's like, oh, you're such a wonderful boy, Rob, wanting to hang out more and more with me. Sure, let's have supper. Really, I've got this ulterior motive. So I show up for supper, and I ask her how her day was, and I say, where all did you go today? And she says, well, I went to work, I got groceries, and I came home. And I say, okay, did you go anywhere else today? Same story, work, groceries, home. Then I ask, by chance did you stop anywhere? Say when you were driving, did you get out of your car for any reason, a side trip, that kind of a thing? She reflects and says, no. You know, I went to work, I got groceries, and came home. I asked her, did you get out of your car even for a second? And so on and so on. You see where this is going. The questions get narrower and narrower until I ask her, did you by chance go to a gas station? And she pauses and she thinks and she says, yeah, I did. Why? And so the point that I like to make is downstream and end users, there's a complete, we don't even think about this activity. It's so habitual, gassing up. It's so automatic, it doesn't even register as a thing that we do. It's been normalized for a couple of generations. And if that's the situation downstream, if the simple act of gassing up doesn't even register as a thing that we do, how on earth are we going to affect things upstream? How on earth are we going to impact this thing called climate change if markets are so complacent that the simple act of buying the product doesn't even register as something that we do? So by engaging people downstream, by sort of highlighting the demand side of the equation, we might not be vocally saying we want, you know, oil and we want pipelines and so on, but in effect, as long as that's the situation downstream, that's actually what's occurring. So what this idea does quite simply is it draws attention to this, and it makes us say, you know, well, but what am I supposed to do? If not this, then what? I mean, there I am at the gas station. I'm not going to abandon my car and walk away. I'm going to fill up my empty tank. Of course I will. And I'm going to go back next week and do the same thing. But if week after week, as often as I gas up, I'm asking the question, what am I supposed to do? What are my options? If we're sort of causing a sense of dissatisfaction, you know, in the marketplace downstream, that then creates more space for alternatives. So I think you'll see two things. One, you'll see an individual response. Two, you'll see a collective response. So on the individual side of things, for people that are concerned about climate change, have read about it, say, again, this idea brings the problem closer, makes them feel more responsible for it, takes these hidden costs, makes them visible, communicates the problem in a really, really unique way. So given all of the compelling aspects of this simple policy intervention, that could be enough to nudge someone perhaps into, you know what, I might be more interested in carpooling now, or I might be more interested in public transit. Maybe I've been wanting to read more books. That was my New Year's resolution. It actually was my New Year's resolution, and I've been failing on that. But let's say that's your New Year's resolution. Maybe you're now more open to, sure, the bus might take a bit longer, but I'll read my book then, and I'm feeling a bit better about the situation. Maybe I'll ride my bike to work in the summer. Whatever the individual change in behavior is, there's then a measurable reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The more interesting piece, though, is I think how this impacts the collective conversation. Because if I now am asking that question, where this thing never really registered as an act before, but I'm saying, what are my options? What am I supposed to do? If my neighbor's asking the same question, if my neighbor's neighbor is, and if an entire community starts to ask this question, indeed an entire nation, and as you'll learn soon enough, perhaps even the entire world starts to ask this question, because that is our ultimate game plan, imagine how that changes the conversation in such a way that gives space for politicians to address this issue. So here in Toronto, there's often a conversation that goes, well, we need better public transit. And then as soon as someone says, hey, let's pay for it, the conversation breaks down. And I understand, actually, in Vancouver, now there's a conversation on funding public transit. And the last bit I read, polling actually isn't that high among drivers, and the referendum might not actually make it. Who knows? I say to myself, imagine if for the last 3 months, drivers collectively were saying, what are my options? What am I supposed to do? In the space then, a politician steps in and says, look, let's all collectively pay a little bit more to have a really wonderful public transit system. So that's what this idea is actually geared at. It changes the social conditions around the issue in such a way to enable us to really address it in a meaningful way. So politicians will have more political capital, more political license to perhaps fund public transit, to have, maybe it's better cycling infrastructure. Maybe this might infiltrate other conversations. What does a complete community look like? Maybe it affects planning decisions and so on. Who knows? Maybe perhaps at other levels of government, it changes the conversation on pricing carbon. We might then be more amenable to that sort of a thing, or at least less opposed to it. So it gives more space for governments to respond, thinking back to that Barack Obama quote. I think on the business side of things, you'll see an interesting response too, because what we've effectively done is we've taken a market that's previously been complacent, satisfied with the status quo solution. We've denormalized it. We've created a bit of dissatisfaction with that. When you do that then, the flip side of that, of course, is you're creating broader demand for alternatives. So if I am Ford, if I'm General Motors, I'm just in the business of selling you a mobility solution. It's kind of actually looked the exact same as it has for about 100 years now. But imagine if people get less and less satisfied with that solution, if marketplaces are wanting something else. To me, that's the sound of money, because here's now this segment of the marketplace that's not being catered to. They're no longer satisfied with their existing options. I'm then incentivized to put a little bit of money into research and development, maybe retool my plant, maybe retrain my employees, to bring to market that product that I always bring out at auto shows, but never actually manufacture and make available for people. And it's interesting. Why would an auto manufacturer do that? Spend a lot of money on innovation. Why would they take a risk with a different product offering if mostly the same old thing has been selling for years? So there's value to challenging market complacency, to engaging users downstream. That creates dissatisfaction with status quo solutions, stimulates broader demand for alternatives, and catalyzes innovation. So that's what we're hoping to see change. I remember, and I just added these 2 points to the slide. This is a talk that I gave in a community in the East Coast a couple weeks ago. Someone interjected and said, "This is brilliant, I love it. It's never going to work here, we're too conservative." And I'm like, guys, this is a conservative idea. It's sort of a right of spectrum idea. If you look closely at the labels that I've designed, they're non-prescriptive. They don't actually tell you what to do. There might be room for a website on it where you're then giving people resources for that individual behavioral change. But really, it's a market-friendly intervention. All it does is it provides markets with relevant information and relies on markets to respond. So it ends up being a very non-prescriptive, market-friendly intervention. There's something for people here on all ends of the spectrum, for people with strong environmental values, people with sort of more market-friendly values, and so on. And just so you know, it's not sort of the story about my mother. This is actually rooted in some research. So this is a quote from the leading behavioral economics think tank out of the United Kingdom. Psychologists' theories on changing habits generally involve first unfreezing the subconscious action and raising it to a conscious level where we can consider the merits of alternative behaviors. So going back to what I said at the outset, here we are, this systemic sort of status quo. We need to transition to this other place. What this does is it sort of unfreezes this heretofore unconscious automatic act, brings us to a place where we're more able to consider alternatives. This facilitates the transition. So again, climate change actually isn't the problem. We can address that. We can deal with it. The problem is inaction on climate change, and this simple, low-cost intervention addresses that. This slide, I'm going to show you how inefficient, actually. People don't realize how inefficient the internal combustion engine is. So here we have gasoline. It just has chemical energy stored in hydrocarbons. That we put into an internal combustion engine. There's a spark combustion in a chamber, and sort of pistons go up and down. That ends up, I say it's connected to the elbow, which is connected to the knee bone, and so on. Eventually, it moves the wheels forward. But you actually get two things out of that. So you end up getting a lot of heat and exhaust. So a lot of the energy stored in hydrocarbons is lost, is wasted to heat and exhaust. Only about 20% of it is converted into useful mechanical energy to get the wheels to move forward. Of that, it goes to actually move two things forward. One, it goes to move a big vehicle. In 2010, I think it was, the average new vehicle in North America weighed about 4,000 pounds. I might weigh about 150 pounds. So of the total weight being moved, only about 4% of it goes to move me from A to B. About 96% of it goes to move a big hunk of metal back and forth, back and forth. So of the 20% of useful energy that we've taken out of this natural resource, 4% of it goes to move me from A to B. If you do the math, it's 0.08%. We're being generous, we're rounding up. But think about it. Of the energy stored in gasoline, only about 1% of it goes to move me from A to B. That is a tremendous waste of a natural resource. We really need to use this resource in more conservative ways. I say to myself, imagine if we used other natural resources in this manner. So imagine if I walked into a forest and I chopped down 100 trees. So there I am, I'm harvesting, extracting that natural resource in the same way that we extract, say, oil. Imagine then, I bring that raw lumber to a timber where it's then processed into usable product. Much in the same way, you take oil, you process it into gasoline. Then we move it to a lumber yard, right? Much like you move this product to the individual retailer. Someone purchases it. Let's say they buy 100 2x4s to make a home, something like that. They bring it to the construction site where its ultimate use is going to happen. They stick one of those pieces of wood into the ground, and then they throw out 99 of those pieces of wood. We would say, well, that is incredibly wasteful. Why on earth would we treat that natural resource in that way? That's actually how we're treating this natural resource. Of course, the latter example, it's a form of visible waste. This is an invisible waste. So there's value, again, in getting us to look at the sort of downstream aspect. We talk a lot about pipelines and shipping and tar sands and offshore drilling and so on. It's really important that we look at this side of the equation, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But just to sort of highlight the evolution of fuel economy in this sector, it was in 1908 that the Ford Model T came off the assembly line, the world's real first, at least North America's anyway, mass-produced vehicle. Got between 6 and 9 kilometers per liter. This is taken off of Ford's website. Another typical car, about half a century later, gets about 9 kilometers per liter. And then we've got another car, a little more recent, gets about 6 kilometers per liter. Of course, this definitely isn't one of the more efficient vehicles out there, but more efficient vehicles aren't actually doing much better. So notice, over the course of a century, this industry has stagnated when it comes to fuel economy. Above the line is what makes it to market, below the line is what doesn't make it to market. So every year, Shell hosts something called the Eco Marathon, and they invite high school students and university students to design the most fuel-efficient vehicles they can. This is the world's most fuel-efficient vehicle. Gets over 5,000 kilometers per liter. It runs on a hydrogen fuel cell, but they did sort of this equivalency calculation to figure out what it would be in terms of gasoline consumption. This car, I think, is hilarious. It reminds me of the Oscar Wiener hot dog mobile, just the coloring of it. Built by high school students in the 2012 competition. I think it was in the Americas. Could have been North America, actually. In any event, it got 930 kilometers per liter. It was in 2013, so this wasn't even the best in category. It was in 2013 in the European competition that the gasoline prototype category, the winner of that one, so a car that runs on regular old gasoline, got just under 3,000 kilometers per liter. Now this, I'm not suggesting that we need to go to this sort of a thing. These vehicles, the way they're doing what they do is they're very aerodynamic, they're very low to the ground, they're very lightweight, and they're maxing out at maybe 40, 50 kilometers per hour. So, in a city though, if you think about it, you might not go much faster than 50 kilometers per hour. So maybe there is sort of an application for this sort of a thing down the road. I like to say sometimes, let's go full Jetson, let's embrace it, right? Jetsons. Really though, I'm not suggesting we need to transition here. I'm simply saying this is at the extreme end of inefficiency. This is at the extreme end of efficiency. There's many places we can transition to in between. Of course, there's electric vehicles too that prices are coming down lower and lower and lower. Interestingly, through economies of scale, if you can stimulate broader demand for those sorts of solutions, care of perhaps a simple intervention like this idea, the more of us that want it, the more you're giving an industry a chance to develop economies of scale, price points come down, right? So there are all sorts of places we can transition to. Electric vehicles use this product more conservatively in gasoline vehicles and so on. Of course, there's public transit. You can burn fuel in one engine and move 1 or 2 people, or a bus. Burn fuel in one engine and move 50 people. Lots of places we can go to. I sometimes say, necessity is the mother of invention. All this idea does is it injects a little more necessity into the system. So going back to a point I was making earlier, we tend to have this upstream focus, and there are a lot of campaigns that look at oil sands or tar sands, a lot of campaigns that look at shipping, and I know this is very prominent in the part of the country where you live, a lot of people that look at pipelines, and there tends to be almost exclusively this upstream focused in media, among activists, and so on. And again, it's important because there are a lot of risks, associated with moving the product. There's a lot at stake, a lot of risks, with pipelines, and there's a lot of local impacts that need to be acknowledged that come from the tar sands. And so I do acknowledge that, and we need to address it for those reasons. Having said that, though, we don't seem to ask the question, how do we use the product? And that's a fundamental question we need to ask if we actually want to address this broader change. So I think in part, we look upstream because it's a little more comfortable. It's a bit easier to shake our fist, at pipelines and oil sands and so on and blame Alberta. It's easier to sort of reflect the mirror upstream. It's a little more challenging to reflect the mirror downstream and acknowledge at the end of all of this is actually me holding on to this thing. I think though, what I said before, there's value to that, tremendous value. Complacent markets don't change, they stagnate. If you can cause a bit of dissatisfaction with status quo solutions, that's actually how you drive change upstream and affect this sort of thing. Because the only reason this exists is because there's a market for the product. The only reason that exists is because there's a market for the product. The only reason that exists is because there's a market for the product. So it's critical that we start asking the simple question, how do we use this product? It's critical that we engage end use. More to the point though, while there are a lot of local impacts and risks associated with extraction and with moving product, if you are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, if climate change is your area of concern, it's really important that we ask the question, how do we use the product? Because if you look at what's called a well-to-wheel analysis, so well, point of extraction, to wheel, point of use, if you look at the entire product life cycle, you can figure out what area has the largest carbon footprint. So here on the x-axis, we sort of have closer to well and closer to wheel. So point of extraction, moving the product, refining it, and so on, and then using the product, right? And then here on the y-axis are a variety of fuels. So let's compare Canadian oil sands to Canadian conventional crude. And we often hear oil sands are, 3 times as dirty as regular oil. And that's true. If you look upstream, yeah, it's roughly 3 times as intense when it comes to carbon emissions when you look upstream. But you have to take that as a percentage of the overall product life cycle, well to wheel. And that's when you realize, well, what is this blue stuff? Clearly, the vast majority of emissions come from this. And I don't know how visible this is, but it's vehicle combustion. So at the end of the day, the largest impact is me using the product, you using the product, all of us collectively using the product. That's also where you have the most room for gain. It's something like, depending on the fuel source, roughly 70 to 80% of emissions come from combustion. And if you think about it, we should know this intuitively. Yeah, there's emissions, from upstream and from moving the product, but the problem isn't, when it comes to climate change, taking the stuff out of the ground. The problem isn't moving it. The problem is lighting it on fire, which is what we all do. So again, I have to acknowledge that there are a lot of local and important, aspects to the extraction of this product and the shipping of this product. And I am in support of all sorts of campaigns that address that. But at the end of the day, when it comes to climate change, this is the question that we need to be asking. And even if you do want to address those upstream aspects, as long as there's demand for the product, as long as there's a market for it, industry will deliver it. So in addressing this downstream aspect, you're actually changing things upstream. Really more to the point, just to highlight this, even if somehow we decided to stop taking fossil fuels from the oil sands tomorrow, if that were to happen, well, okay, so let's switch on to old conventional crude. Really, this is the amount that we would save. We still have this whole entire problem. So it's important that we start to engage the demand side of the equation. And I tend to think that actually, when it comes to media coverage on this issue, oftentimes climate change nationally is understood as a problem of oil sands and pipelines and so on. This doesn't get any attention, but it really needs to get more attention, and this is something that this intervention can help achieve. The last bit, just to really drive this point home, how disconnected are we? We don't even see the product. So this is a gas pump that was common in the 20s and 30s, and you'll notice that there's a little hand pump here. So what would happen at the gas station is there'd be a gas reservoir or a big tank buried under the pump. People would use their hands to sort of pump it, or there'd be a small electric motor there. That would bring the fuel up here to fill this glass cylinder. So you might fill it up to here and say, this is the amount I want. You might fill it up to here and stop there. And then there'd be a hose attached onto this. You'd put that in your car, and gravity would flow the product into your vehicle. It's interesting, though. I think in this situation, you would see the product. You would have some sense of, well, here's this liquid. Where does it come from, right? You'd be somewhat connected to it. And then you'd come back the following week to buy more, and you'd have this sense of, well, where does this all go? This perhaps sense of, I'm combusting it. There are emissions. Now, we don't even see the product, and it's amazing. Sometimes, so there's, I guess, Bathurst right out the window there. Sometimes I'll stare out the window and I'll put on my X-ray vision, and I'll see tanks of gasoline in the bellies of vehicles, and as the vehicles accelerate, the gas will sort of go to the back of the tank. As they decelerate, as they approach the red, it'll go to the front of the tank, just be splashing in there. And we have no real connection, no real sense that we're actually consuming this product. So how on earth do we expect to have any sort of an impact on this issue if that's the situation downstream? So again, it's critical that we engage end users. How are we wanting to do this? So I've spent close to 2 years, which if you stay for the hidden track at the end, I'll give you a fun story there. But I've spent close to 2 years traveling the country to get communities to adopt these climate change warning labels. And I have a legal report on our website both in the British Columbia context and the Ontario context, of how communities can use their licensing powers to actually implement this into law. And so that's available at our website if you want to look into it. The challenge, though, is the first community to do this really is in all likelihood inviting the prospect of litigation. So industry, they might see this, they might not like it, they might challenge your jurisdiction to do it. So they'll file an application with the court and say, well, we think this is beyond your powers as a municipality. And so there's a lot of research that I've done that if you're interested in reading that, you can read that and come to your own conclusions. And I should say none of this, of course, is legal advice. I'm only licensed to practice here in Ontario, but there's food for thought anyway for you to explore this further. I found, though, that communities were reluctant to pursue that approach because of the prospect of inviting litigation. And politically, I appreciate that concern. No one really wants to be put in that position. And so while a lot of people liked the idea and wanted to support it, they were concerned about the particular pathway to do it. The exciting thing is now, there's been a really amazing development in the community of West Vancouver where that council has shown tremendous leadership, and they passed. They're the first community in all of Canada to pass a resolution that's going to go through the Union of British Columbia Municipalities and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. In the former, September, I believe, is the vote, and in the latter, it'll be put to a vote in June of 2016. And that resolution basically is, if I have my slides right, it says, and this is just an excerpt of it, you can go to our website and read the full piece, but that all vendors of retail petroleum products in Canada be legislated to provide warning labels on all pump handles. So the nice thing with that, and for communities, we're now asking them to support this resolution. I was at the FCM convention in London, the Sustainable Communities Convention in mid-February. Mayors, councillors, staff from across the country were there. They came to talk to me at my booth, where I had this funny little thing, and people are wondering, what on earth is this exhibitor selling? And I would say, here's the idea, here's why it's compelling, and here's a unique pathway forward, where really, it's just a resolution. So there's no real legal risk, financial risk, political risk. It's just sort of a statement saying we should have these. The nice thing is, though, the way I see it, my homework over the next while is to visit communities across the country and get them to support this, because if at the end of the day, both in the UBCM and the FCM, if this resolution is voted on and it passes, this is then official policy of cities and towns across the country. You're then enabling a legislator at a senior level of government to say, look, this is just what cities and towns want. They'll get to shrug their shoulders, say this is what cities and towns want. We're just introducing a bill to that effect. So a politician then is a little more free to introduce this because they're not really wearing that decision. They're not having to use much political capital to push it. The funny irony is the aspect of diffusion of responsibility. One of the reasons we failed to address this problem, sort of paradoxically, or maybe the irony of it, enables this legislative pathway forward, because at the end of the day, no one's really wearing the decision. Responsibility for it is diffuse. So we're using the same principle to achieve this that actually inhibits us from addressing climate change. So what we're doing is we're asking communities to support this resolution. I'm grateful to the community of Colwood for their leadership in bringing this to the Association of Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities for your consideration. And there are more and more communities that are getting on board. So this might be too small to read, but this is dated March 5th. So Saanich recently endorsed the West Vancouver resolution, and several other communities have since come on board as well. The amazing story is my model is, and I'm actually breaking my rule here by pitching to you, but I'm wanting to share this with youth. I remember being, in I guess it was mid-high school, early high school when I first learned about this, and feeling powerless, feeling voiceless, being very, very concerned. So, I first learned about this more than half my life ago, and I've been concerned about it ever since. And so I'm wanting to empower young people to use their voice to actually speak directly to their counselors and make this change. And it's amazing. This is a 16-year-old girl named Emily who had the courage to, she learned about this project through a radio interview she heard, and she approached her counselors. And the only reason I'm talking to you right now is because she made it happen. So thank you, Emily. 16-year-old girls from BC, I guess, yeah, it's amazing. Teenagers, seriously, are amazing. That's another thing I've learned. If only kids ruled the world. In any event, where are we at right now? So from launching this thing about 2 years ago, and no one really returning any of my emails, I was invited to write a piece on it in Municipal World. It's actually out in this March's edition. And so city and town staff and councillors and mayors across the country are reading about this in what is the country's sort of oldest and one of the most credible municipal magazines. So there's that. I actually wrote a follow-up piece, so I encourage you to find that issue. I wrote a follow-up piece that's going to appear in the April issue. This piece more explains some of the thinking behind it. The April issue explains the West Vancouver resolution and its significance and sort of the way forward. Let's see here. So what is the ultimate game plan? I do want leaders in communities across Canada to support it. I think the only way anything gets changed in this world is through leadership. And what this map is it's all the places in the world that have the tobacco warning labels on them. And if you think about it, you know, the text-only label started in the States, but most, if not the vast majority of these countries now have these visual, the pictorial warning labels. So that's a Canadian innovation that's spread and has had an impact on public health. What's interesting is, you know, there's this audience globally that's been cognitively primed to get this idea. So this unfunded organization out of Toronto, no real resources, no PR budget, no staff, just really one person volunteering their time. Check this out. This is our analytics. We get web traffic from all over the world because we've been cognitively primed with this example. This idea is evocative of that. You know, we smoke cigarettes today, down the road you get sick. Governments have said, well, let's put that down the road consequence onto the package today to help shape attitudes and behaviors. Similarly, we burn fossil fuels today, down the road are a variety of consequences. Wouldn't it be interesting if you could put some of them on some of the things that dispense fossil fuels? So people get this idea. We're actually now in a book in Australia. We were contacted by a lawyer who's writing about us in Australia. This idea is in a textbook in France. Again, they contacted us. Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster with millions of listeners, they contacted us on this. About a month ago, I got a magazine from Sweden. I didn't even recognize what the text was, and so I sort of plugged it into Google Translate, scanned it, plugged it into Google Translate, and found out that, you know, people in Sweden are talking about this. So I think this is testament to the potential that this idea has, and the vision truly is to take it global. And I think the only way we're going to achieve this is if communities say, let's do this, let's lead. You know, if there's a positive outcome at this vote, you're then better ensuring a positive outcome at the UBCM vote. That then better ensures a positive outcome at the June 2016 FCM vote. Let's set a national precedent here that changes the world. Imagine if this simple, inexpensive Canadian policy idea actually went on to spread in such a way that humanity felt a little closer to the problem, a little more responsible for it, had these hidden costs made visible, and received this communication in a really interesting way, how that can help achieve or address this problem of climate inaction. So I really, in many respects, think that this is an important missing piece, and I want us to lead. Last thing to end on, I was in, I think it was in Fredericton, I was couch surfing. This is how I get across the country now, couch surfing. A woman named Kelsey hosted me, and this was what was painted on her bathroom wall. Hi, Kelsey, if you ever see this, thanks for hosting. And it's this, the difference between why and why not. So I tend to sort of share all the reasons why this idea is compelling and why a community might want to pursue it. But lately I've been asking the question, why not? I haven't really talked about the gravity of sort of the situation that we find ourselves in, but climate change has been called by many to be the greatest challenge of our time. If you think about it, you know, here we are right now on this tiny rock that's sort of moving on its own axis, rotating, that's spinning around the sun, completing its orbit once every year, you know, that's then being whipped around our solar system, is being whipped around our galaxy, and our galaxy is moving through outer space at some crazy immeasurable speed. So we're on this tiny rock hurtling through space at this incredible rate, and we've actually changed the chemical composition of that thin layer that supports all life as we know it. We really need to act on this problem. This idea, probably one of the world's, if not the world's, cheapest intervention on this. I think it's incredibly compelling. I ask myself, given the nature and gravity of the problem, why wouldn't we do this? How can we not do this? And if you're to sort of rank order this among all the interventions that one can take on climate change, you know, it's not that restrictive, it's not that interventionist, it's just a little bit of information. We're not saying people can't use this product anymore, we're not saying stop pipelines, we're not saying anything, we're just giving information. So it's perhaps one of the easiest climate interventions out there, and the pathway forward, what I'm suggesting in terms of supporting this resolution, we're not even asking communities to pass this into law now. We're saying just support it, just say this is something that we should do. So perhaps the easiest intervention in the world and one of the easiest pathways forward. So I really ask the question, why wouldn't a community do this? So thank you for listening to my talk, and I really encourage you to support this. There's a lot at stake here, and I'd be really grateful if you supported it. Thank you. And now, the hidden track. We could do this? What am I doing? All right, cool guy, the hidden track. All right, a lot of people have asked, I don't normally do this, but a lot of people have asked, oh, this is an interesting project, tell me about the story behind it. And there's a very, very long story, and I'm happy to chat with whoever wants to chat about this one day. But it starts out with this. So that's me, that's my grandpa. So I practiced law for a bit, grew up in Toronto. I would spend my summers in Saskatchewan on my grandpa's farm. And we had a wonderful relationship, and so I'm really grateful for the time that I spent out there out west. So I found myself practicing law, and I've always watched this problem unfold from the sidelines, watched internationally, you know, negotiation after negotiation that goes nowhere, domestically, government after government not really doing a whole lot on this file, watched the business community not really address this in the way that it should, and watched, quite frankly, NGOs not really address this problem in an adequate way. So there I am watching things unfold from the sidelines. I thought to myself, I want to run for council here in my community on a climate change friendly platform where I'd run on this idea and a handful of other ideas that I've had, some of which are actually really unique, where if I had more time, I'd be pursuing them as well. But in any event, it was a little over 2 years ago now, before I launched this, where I had a phone conversation with my grandfather. And he sensed I wasn't all that happy in what I wanted, in what I was doing. He sensed that I was more interested in other things. And so on this phone call, he ended the conversation, it's important that you enjoy what you're doing, Rob. Do what you love. And so I ended up having to leave. I had a client that I had to see shortly, and so I thanked him. And he actually passed away 2 weeks later. So his last words to me were, do what you love. And so I had this going through my head for a little while. And again, the context is I'm really concerned about this issue. Not happy in what I'm doing, and so on. So I find myself, and this isn't intended to be, you know, morbid or anything, but this is actually a shot of where he was buried in Saskatchewan. And so I found myself there maybe a week later. You know, picture me sort of watching this. There's my grandfather, there's my father who passed away a few years before that, and kind of off the frame, but here is an empty patch of green grass. And so a little over 2 years ago, there I am, you know, do what you love, and looking down, you know, grandfather, father, realizing at some point that's me, and that's something we all get, you know, intellectually, but I sort of, I think, got it at another level anyway. And so I began to ask myself, you know, the deeper questions, and well, what do I value? What do I do with the time that I have here? What's the impact that I want to make? And I want to help us to address this problem. So I ended up coming back home to Toronto. I've got all this going through my head, and as if sort of that scenario isn't enough, it was about 2 months later, I get an envelope from Saskatchewan, and I open it up, and it's a check. And it says in the memo line, it's from my grandfather's estate. And it wasn't a huge sum. It was one that lasted maybe 3 months or so. But I remember as soon as I pulled that out, recognized it for what it was, I actually heard his voice in my head say, do what you love. And I had, you know, 2 or 3 quick thoughts. Oh my goodness, I could take a holiday, I could do this, I could do that. But then I thought, no, you know what? This is a gift. This is something special, and what matters to me. So I decided to just take one of these ideas off the back burner that I wanted to run on here in Toronto and explore it. So I found myself going to the law library, just doing the legal research to try and satisfy myself that, if and when this idea was challenged, a municipality with proper jurisdiction to do it. I was then drawing on my background in business, economics, and psychology. There's a lot of interesting things I was applying to this idea from that. I'm growing to like this idea more and more and more. I actually pitched it to some environmental organizations, but without much success. And so I'm thinking, well, what do? I can't just write a paper and just put it online and hope someone acts on it. I think this is important. So I then started contacting friends and, hey, do you know this thing I've been working on? Do you want to be on my board of directors? I need 3 people to incorporate federally. Next thing you know, I've incorporated this organization, and we had a date for launch. I realized I had a 45-minute commute one way, door to door, so an hour and a half both ways to my old law office. And so I thought, you know what, with 2 weeks to go before our launch, this big public event, I don't think we have enough time. There's so much work to do. And I realized if I eliminate my commute, that's an hour and a half I save a week. If I'm working 7 days a week, that's a full day. So I ended up out of thin air pulling out 2 full days by packing up a bag full of clothing in the streetcar and basically sleeping on the floor of my office for 2 weeks. And I would just go to the gym just to shower. I wouldn't even lift any weights or anything. And there's a lot of funny stories there. But in any event, this is sort of pre-launch what happened. We then launched. It was really fun, and I'm grateful for all my friends. Thank you for helping me with this. I've given talks now all across North America. This has been picked up by media all over the world. A group I've been advising in Berkeley, California, they're actually in the process of passing it into law, and they're implementing it this spring. San Francisco is expected to do the same. So those Americans are taking our, no, just kidding. I am grateful for the leadership in those communities and to the people that were pushing this forward. Thank you. Yeah, so it's amazing. And now this simple pathway forward is getting traction all over Canada. I've even gotten feedback from some councillors in Alberta. Someone asked me, yeah, but Alberta's never going to go for this. I've had people say, thank goodness, because we are so vilified simply for providing a product that we all use. And so people are appreciating the downstream sort of consumer-facing aspect of this intervention and its message of, well, we're all in this together. This was when I was in Victoria. Just a quick fun side story to give you a sense of all the ridiculous stuff that's been happening. I crashed on my friend Drew's at Drew's place. Thank you, Drew, for putting me up. This is what happens. You have to couch surf when you don't have a budget. And I had to meet the mayor of Victoria, the former mayor of Victoria, I guess, to talk about this idea. And I wanted to iron my shirt because I've been living on my backpack, so it's a bit wrinkly. And I realized I can't find my friend Drew's iron, but then I see a pan on his stove, and so I'm like, that's the solution. So I heat up the pan, iron my shirt. My shirt is now wrinkle-free, but as I'm leaving his place, I'm like, oh my goodness, I smell like pancakes. So I apologize, former Mayor of Victoria, Dean Fortin, I believe, for reeking of pancakes that day, but now you know why. How am I doing this? Sometimes people ask about funding. It's really tricky for a not-for-profit without charitable status to get funding. The way the system is structured is basically foundations only give grants to charities and a handful of other entities. And a lot of people want their tax receipts, so it's hard as a not-for-profit. There aren't that many sources of funding. So people say, how do you fund this? Well, I don't have a budget. We actually don't have funding. We've had a couple of crowd funds that have helped, but really you can't have staff off a crowd fund. So this is my place. This is Gordon. Hi, Gordon, if you ever watch this. And I'm renting my place. It's this cute little bungalow that I like. It's covered in ivy on the north end of town. And I'm renting it to a lovely, wonderful tenant there. And this is actually where I live. I live in I was going to use the S word, shitty. Sorry. I live in a shitty, I could say that. A shitty basement apartment in downtown Toronto. It's the difference between the rental income that I get in and what I'm paying for that lets me basically volunteer full-time on this project. And someone was saying, tell me more about this place. I just gave a talk at Ryerson on alternative career paths, because this is as alternative as it gets. And I'm like, you know what? It is terrible. It's in a laneway. Cars will, every night, their lights show up, so they'll light up the entire room. Friday, Saturday nights, like after the bar, this is the wall that, you know, people pee on, really. So it's interesting. I'm not sharing this out of a sense of, you know, I'm not asking for your pity. I guess what the intention behind this is, this truly is the greatest challenge of our time. Again, as I said, we've changed the basic chemistry of our planet. Our oceans are acidified. You know, they're getting warmer. There's so much at stake, and it's such a complex problem. This is one of the easiest, simplest things that we can do. We should do it. And what I'll invite you to consider is this is something that we all as humanity need to address is, well, what are you going to do? You know, I'm ready to do what it takes. I want to transition to a better, more sustainable place. And I think if we all sort of approach this problem in that way together, I think we can get there. And the reason we want to get there is this. I don't have any kids, but this is my friend's kid, Lucine, who now is about 2 years old, I think. And I took a photo off my friend's Facebook, printed it, and I have it on the wall of my bedroom. And I think to myself, you know, we're only here where we are right now. There's no real evil players in this story. I think the true story is our challenges are inertia. It's status quo. That's the enemy. You know, it's just this sense of, well, this is all I've ever known, and so it's hard then to transition to something different. And I say, well, we need to do this because we've sort of inherited this world as a result of decisions that were made before us. This is now the place and time where we find ourselves, and it's the decisions that we make today that will shape Lucine's life. And if we address this, if humanity comes together and really addresses this problem, if we address this in action on climate change piece, I think we can create a wonderful world for Lucine, because she's the one that's going to inherit the Earth. So thank you.